questions about constructing a healthy diet, I would recommend that you do speak to somebody who's actually trained to support you in that. Although the information and the landscape around what you should eat, it changes on such a frequent basis that it's difficult for everybody, I'm sure, including people who are registered dietitians and nutrition researchers, really to keep up with the information. So why this topic? There are a couple of reasons why this topic. One is that the more I teach about wellness coaching, the more the question of eating well comes up. It certainly is one of the 6 physical domains that we talk about when we talk about the different dimensions and domains of wellness. So that comes up a lot. But also the weight loss is a very common goal for people who participate in wellness coaching, and obesity is a huge issue for many people with psychiatric disorders, and based on my working as a trainer and consultant in the field, I think it's also an issue for many people who provide mental health services. So when I talk about diet, I'm not really talking about a diet. I think it's really important not to think of diet as something you do for a short period of time in order to fit into a dress or a suit for a particular event. But if you think about diet in terms of sort of what you eat in general, what you eat typically, and what you're going to eat for the rest of your life, I think that will give you more of the framework that I'm talking about. And as you can tell from the title, it's not just what you eat, but it's also, oops, sorry about that, previous. It's also when you eat, how you eat, where you eat, why you eat, and things like your food environment and how you think about food. So I'm going to cover each of these topical areas bit by bit as we go through. So my latest obsession has been reading about food. So here's a little light reading. These are things I've read over the winter, and some of them audio books, some of them actually read them myself. And I must apologize to my poor husband, who has been the brunt of my spouting all this information to him as I'm reading through all these books. So I'm going to mention these books. They are listed on your reading list. These books that are up here are really, for the most part, fairly easy to read, and I'll be referring to them specifically, and you can check them out on the reference list and the handouts. The handouts were sent out in advance of the webinar, but also will be available to you on the Missouri Wellness website after the webinar. So I did want to talk a little bit at the beginning about what you eat. And I know it's really a mystery because there are conflicting messages. And one of the things that you hear all the time is something comes in the newspaper and it says you shouldn't drink coffee, it'll kill you. And then the next thing it says you should drink coffee because it will extend your life. And then the next thing says, well, you should drink coffee but not too much. And so we're bombarded by these conflicting messages that are out there. And there are very few areas of common agreement. So basically, all this reading that I've been doing lately, all this information that I've been trying to put together for this webinar, has very few areas of common agreement. And these are listed right here on the slide. Liquid calories in general, most experts agree, are bad. It's not a good idea to get most of your calories or any large proportion of your calories from any form of liquid, whether that be soda or juice or smoothies or whatever. In general, it's not recommended, and the main reason for that is because the liquid foods are rapidly digested and they tend to lack fiber. So that's one. The second one is there's a general agreement that processed foods are bad. It's virtually impossible these days for anybody who does anything other than cook to eliminate processed foods altogether. But there's a lot that you can do to reduce your consumption of processed foods, and there's a lot you can do to shift to foods that are less processed in contrast to foods that are more processed. And when I say processed foods, I don't just mean something that's pre-cooked. but I mean something that has been prepared and tends to have added components like fat, sugar, and salt, and also tends to have chemical preservatives in them. So in general, for the most part, you're going to find people recognizing that these are probably best to eliminate to the extent that you can do so. And everybody seems to agree that leafy green vegetables are good. So that would be things like spinach, kale, Swiss chard, stuff like that. I mean, I'm not even familiar with all the leafy green vegetables out there. Kale is hot right now. Everybody wants to eat kale. That's probably a good idea based on all these people. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit in this section is recent research on the balance that you should eat of fat, carbohydrates, and protein. And there's a lot of arguments and a lot of different popular diets out there about that compares these different diets or recommends these different diets. And I wanted to describe for you a relatively recent article that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2007. And this is called the A to Z weight loss study. So it's listed, if you're interested in this, it's listed in your reference list as Battle of the Diets. And there's a YouTube video that is presented by the lead author on this study. And the video is about an hour and a quarter. So you have to be patient to get through it. I found it absolutely fascinating. But you don't have to do it, because I'm going to give you the synopsis of the study. Now, the interesting thing about this particular study, and if you have some more questions about it, you can hang on to them at the end, and I'll try to address them, or you can just type them in the question box, the chat box, and I'll try to address them as I'm going along. So this is called the A to Z study because it compares 4 specific diets. And the study was very well designed. I won't go into the complicated things that make it well designed, but the researcher, who's very entertaining, easy to follow, on the YouTube video explains some of the things they did to make sure the study was well done. So the comparison studies, A-T-O-Z, there were 4 studies, A to Z. The first one was Atkins, which, as you probably know, is a very low-carb diet. The second one is the traditional diet, which is recommended by most nutrition counselors and dietitians, and that would be a low-fat diet. One of the things that you probably could figure out if you think about it for a minute, although I had never thought about it for a minute, is if you cut one part of your diet, like if you cut fat, of necessity, the other components in your diet tend to go up. So in Atkins, for example, you tend to eat more protein and fat because you're eating fewer carbs. In the traditional diet, you recommended, they call it the LEARN diet, lifestyle, exercise, attitudes, relationships, and nutrition is the full title of it. But this is, he's calling it for short, the traditional diet. That's low fat, and by necessity, if you have low fat, you undoubtedly are eating a higher carbohydrate diet. The Ornish diet, this is Dean Ornish, who developed this very high carb, extremely low fat diet aiming to address people with heart conditions, and it has been very, very successful in quite a controlled environment, less successful if people try to follow it on their own. And the Zone diet, which is low carb. So we've got low carb, we've got low fat, high carb, we've got very high carb, and very low carb. And he compares these 4 diets, and the message that he says that comes from the diet, the clear winner in this diet was the Atkins diet, the low carbohydrate diet, which really goes against most of the typical recommendations by dietitians today. One of the things that he says is that it's important, the thing that he says to conclude from the diet is that it's important to eliminate as much as possible refined carbohydrates, and he's considering the possibility that probably you should decrease the degree to which you consume grains in general, whether whole grains or not. But if you're going to eat grains, they should be whole grains, and you should get rid of things like white bread and soda. Now, that's not going to be a surprise to anybody. So I'm mentioning this study because it's a relative, first of all, it's a relatively new study, and it's very well designed, so I think it's quite useful information. It also follows people's use of these diets in real life, not in a controlled environment where they're locked up sort of at a camp. I just got a message, is it still supposed to be on this slide? Yes, it's still supposed to be on this slide. I haven't changed the slide yet. So we're still talking about what you eat. So because these were studied in a real life environment, there was a good sense of whether people actually could survive on these diets, and they were followed up for a year. So it was a really good study. So this message is relatively new, that we should go maybe in a low-carb direction. And the other thing that is interesting to bring it up is that it's directly at odds with the traditional diet that's recommended. So what you eat, I don't know. I would recommend, if you're really interested in what you eat, that you watch that video and draw your own conclusions and sort of keep an eye on what's out there. To make it easier, and now I'm switching slides here. To make it easier, this is a very easy-to-read book. There are several books written by this guy, Michael Pollan, of the New York Times, and he's a very engaging writer. He has 3 very simple food rules. He says, eat food, and by eating food, he means eating real food. He's got all sorts of extra rules connected to this, like eat food that doesn't have a label, which I think is an interesting way to think about processed foods. Anything with a label on it could be considered processed food. If it has to have a label, it's because somebody's done something to it, and then it falls under the guidelines that require the label. So he says, eat real food. Don't eat things your grandmother wouldn't recognize it as food. All sorts of things like that. But basically, the basic idea is eat food that's real food, not invented food or engineered food. The second one is not too much, which I think is always good advice. How you do that, that's another question that we'll talk about a little bit later in the webinar. And he advocates for eating mostly plants. However, this is one of the areas that's under debate. So there's another fellow, Gary Taub, and his book is also listed in the back page of your handout, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. And he says that a very low-carb diet with lots of meat and fat is probably a good idea, although he still recommends a lot of leafy green vegetables. So mostly plants, that's sort of debate, although I like the idea of mostly plants and not only plants, which he also talked about in his book, The Omnivorous Dilemma. The other information that I'll be touching on a little bit as I go through here has to do with the idea of limited refined carbohydrates. And there are a couple of books on the list by Robert Lustig and David Kessler, who are really anti-sugar people. And in the interest of supporting multiple sides of the argument and leaving it up to you to decide for yourself, you can always read the research that's conducted by people who are paid for by the high fructose corn industry, who tell you it's perfectly fine to eat food. So those are the sort of what to eat. Like I say, there's a lot of debate about it, but certainly you're not going to go wrong if you cut sugar, cut processed foods, and eat leafy green vegetables. Those are definitely going to stand you in good stead as rules. So what about the other things, not just what you eat? So let's talk a little bit about when you eat. And this is an interesting question to me. So I had this on my list of things I wanted to talk about anyway, but it's become a personal issue for me. So I wanted to talk for a second about how that issue has come about and why I'm quite interested in this at the moment. So the when you eat, I had managed to lose about 20 pounds a few years ago and kept it off just by adjusting my diet. And the diet that I followed, if you're interested, is called the I diet or the instinct diet, which I think is, I thought I had it on the list, but I don't. Oh yeah, Roberts. It's under Roberts on the list. And I had, as part of that diet, I was eating 3 meals a day and 2 snacks, and included a higher percentage of protein than I was eating before, which I found quite helpful. And also, Susan, I think her first name is Susan Roberts, who's a nutrition researcher at Tufts University. She also talks about the importance of having a little bit of fat in every meal and with every snack because it helps slow down your metabolism and helps you stay fuller longer. So I was eating these 5 meals a day, and when I was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and put on medication for that, because of the way the medication has to be taken without not in close proximity to a meal, I've gotten to the point where now I've had to suddenly shift to 3 square meals a day. And so I've been interested in, well, is that going to make a difference in terms of my weight, and is that going to make a difference in terms of what I eat or whether I get hungry or whatever. And my experience is not going to be a good answer because Parkinson's disease also does weird things to your brain and affects whether you're hungry and whether you're interested in eating and stuff. So I'm not really a good example. So I went looking into this question, and basically I can't find anything to answer the question of 3 square meals a day versus added snacks. I can't find any research on that. Added snacks are very often recommended as a way you eat, as a way of keeping yourself from getting hungry. But I think the risk of added snacks is that people tend to eat 5 meals a day instead of 3 meals a day plus 2 small snacks. So what constitutes a snack? That's something that you kind of have to figure out. And if you're interested in how much of something you should eat, then you can kind of divide your daily allotment of calories, which is probably much less than you think it should be. You can divide that across what 3 meals would look like, with maybe somewhere between 100 and 200 calories per snack, which is about an apple and a small handful of nuts. So the second question is interesting to me because several of the books that I was reading lately talk about this tendency in American culture now to eat constantly. And so the question of, should you eat at scheduled times? Should you eat what happens if you eat at random times? What happens if you eat constantly during the day? And the things that I've come up with on the research based on that is, first of all, I think the idea of constantly eating, like always having something to eat, always consuming calories through the entire day, is probably not a good idea, simply because it will increase just the general volume of calories that you're consuming. And it also contributes to the idea of mindless eating, which I'll come back to. One of the books on the list by a guy named Brian Wansink, Mindless Eating. He also has a somewhat entertaining website where he talks about some of his weird research. He's a diabolical researcher, and I'll describe some of his research in a minute. He talks about mindless eating, and that the problem with mindless eating rather than mindful eating is that you tend to consume a lot more than you intended to. So planning times to eat, whether it's 3 meals a day or 3 meals a day and snacks or whatever, but having scheduled time really seems to help people plan better what they eat and keep to a steady diet that includes healthy foods. So it seems to be that scheduled times are better than random times or constant times. There also are some metabolism models and some animal research. I couldn't find any human research on this question, but the animal research and the theoretical model suggest that if you have periods of time in the day when you restrict consumption, so that means, like, for example, after supper you don't eat anything until breakfast, so you have 12 or more hours between meals, that restriction time is actually probably good, and in animal research, having periods of restriction when you don't eat seem to counteract disease processes. So there does seem to be some increased health for people who have time between periods of eating. So scheduled times is probably best, and certainly having a gap between, for example, supper and breakfast is a good idea. So the other questions that come up a lot are breakfast. Is breakfast important? Also, there's no consistent research really on that. So I can't say if overall health or weight control is really assisted by breakfast. However, there's something called the National Weight Control Registry, and you can look this up online. You just Google National Weight Control Registry, it comes up. And the National Weight Control Registry is a place where people who have lost a significant amount of weight, I think it's 30 pounds or more, and have kept it off, and I think it's for over a year, they fill out a survey instrument about their eating patterns. And that information on those, what they call successful losers, are summarized and published on their website. And when you look at that website of things that people have done to successfully lose weight and keep the weight off, 78% of people in that group actually are breakfast eaters. Every day they eat breakfast. So that doesn't mean that eating breakfast is critical. It simply says that most people who are successful losers, weight losers, eat breakfast every day, but it also says that 12% of people who are successful at losing weight and keep weight off don't eat breakfast every day. So the breakfast question is probably something that you would experiment with on your own. However, the timing of your meals, there is some research on that, and the timing of your meals does seem to make a difference whether or not that includes breakfast. So the question of, is eating near bedtime a problem? Again, there's not a large amount of research on this, but there is some research that suggests that eating late in the day is not a good idea. So there are a couple of things related to that. Some research suggests that it can make weight loss efforts less effective. So the idea that the more calories you eat early in the day and the fewer calories you eat later in the day actually facilitates weight loss. So that doesn't necessarily say that you have to eat breakfast, but it certainly says that the amount you eat over the course of the day should decrease progressively, whereas in many typical American family diets, their big meal is the dinner meal. So the old adage of eating breakfast like a king and dinner like a pauper is probably a good idea. Small dinners, larger meals earlier in the day. And there were a couple of studies that look at, there's an interest, a whole line of research on circadian rhythms, which is how your physiology changes over the course of the 24-hour time period. And some of these circadian rhythm researchers are beginning to look at times of day when people eat. And I found two research study references that talk about a higher body mass index, which means people who are more overweight or who are obese. Higher body mass index is associated with eating after 8 p.m. and is also associated with eating within 4 hours of sleep onset. So that means if you go to bed at 10 o'clock, that you should be done eating for the day at 6. If you go to bed at 11, you should be done eating but for the day at 7. And then in general, regardless of when you go to bed, eating after 8 o'clock is not a good idea. So the idea of evening snacking, while there's not a lot of research there is some research on human beings that suggests that it's a potential problem. There also are some suggestions that eating late also can contribute to gastric reflux, which can interfere with your sleep too. So if that's an issue for you, then that's certainly something to keep in mind as well. So that's the when you eat question. Not a lot of clear answers to that one, but some suggestions to think about. The next question is how and where you eat. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about environmental influences on food as I go along here the next couple of slides. Mindfully or mindlessly, I already mentioned this idea that people are paying attention to what they eat or not paying attention to what they eat. And then there are people who are multitasking when they eat. And in general, it certainly seems like mindful eating, attention to what you eat makes a difference. So let me tell you about this guy, Brian Wansink. And this picture is not from his website. It's from somebody else's website, but I think it's a pretty effective picture. Brian Wansink is one of the great advocates for smaller plates. Same size of portion, smaller plates. People tend to take less when they have a smaller plate, and people tend to eat what's on their plate regardless. So one of his diabolical food research experiments, which he conducts in his restaurant, which is a food laboratory, and they change this restaurant, and they have meals there. I don't know if it's every week or something like that, and they do different research. So people come, they have a nice meal, and it's a pretty well discounted meal, but they have to participate in the research. And so one of the studies that he did was he and his staff rigged up this thing so that a soup bowl had a tube in the bottom of it, and when people ate from the soup bowl, it would replenish through the tube. So there was always the same amount in the bowl. So what he told people to do was just to go ahead and eat as much soup as they wanted, and for the people who did not have the bottomless bowl, they could eat what they wanted and get extra if they wanted it, I think is the way the study went. But anyway, the numbers were pretty significant. It was something like people eating out of the bottomless bowl ate something like 78% more soup than the other people. I mean, it was some huge and sort of absurd number. But the idea that if there's food there, you respond to the external cues about how much food there is available, how much food you should eat, whether you're hungry or whether there's food still in the dish, seems to make a difference. And the more mindless you are about eating, the more you're going to be responsive to either these small, subtle cues or these more significant external cues. Certainly the location where you eat makes a difference. Certain locations make people eat more, and people eat faster when there are bright lights and slower when the lights are dim and there are candles and things like that, and affects the serving size as well. So one of the things that Wansink has on his website are some cartoons. So he has these cartoons to summarize his research. So here is one of his studies, what skinny people unknowingly do at the Chinese buffet. So most skinny people scan the buffet before they serve themselves. They walk down the whole buffet. They tend to sit away from the buffet when they sit down. They tend to chew more per bite. At the Chinese buffet, they're more likely to use chopsticks and a smaller plate. And I thought this was interesting. They're twice as likely to put their napkin in your lap. So wanting is not necessarily saying that if you put your napkin in your lap, you'll eat less. But I think it's part of the idea of arranging the setting in a way so that you slow down how you eat. You change how you eat. You change the setting in which you eat. There are also some other things related to your food environment. So here's a picture of a jam-packed pantry. This is not my son's pantry. This is not my pantry. It's just a random pantry I found online. But I want to use the example of my son's pantry. He doesn't know I'm talking about this, so if you know him, please don't tell him. He shops at one of these giant stores, BJ's, and they tend to buy, because it's a bargain, they tend to buy in bulk. And one of the things that you find when you look in his pantry, in his overflow pantry in the basement, he's got maybe 6 or 8 or 10 jars of peanut butter in there. And that would be what you would call a food-rich environment. There's plenty to eat. He's never going to run out. The zombie apocalypse comes, he's going to be eating peanut butter. He's not going to have any problem. Just lock the door and they'll be able to survive. So the food-rich environment, it seems like a good idea, but the interesting thing is the more food-rich the environment, the more you're likely to eat. And the suggestion is, from several people who try to explain these things, is that the more you see, the more you eat, is based on the sort of evolutionary idea that you had to eat enough during times of plenty to help you survive times of famine. So the idea is that people are kind of innately programmed to eat more when there's a lot of food available. So it's something to think about how much food is out there for you to see. And the other story that I told recently to the wellness coaching trainings that we just had is when my other son was living with us, and we had some overflow from the pantry, so they had some snacks and stuff on the counter. Before they had moved in with us, we were very careful to keep the counter clean unless we had a bowl of fruit out on the counter. And it was interesting to me when they were, my son and his girlfriend were living here, I was not interested in eating the things they had on the counter because they had potato chips and stuff, which usually don't appeal to me. It was the very fact that there was all this food there, I felt pressured to eat more. And it was kind of interesting because I was surprised that I had that experience. So having less there, at least for me, seems to trigger less sense of urgency around wanting to eat. Other things that are a factor is convenience, that people will eat things that appear to be convenient. They're not necessarily as convenient as you think they are. It doesn't take that much longer, for example, to make a cake from scratch as to make a cake from a mix. Not that you should be necessarily eating cake in the first place, but there are a lot of convenience foods that people buy and use because they seem easier. And the convenience foods tend to be packaged, processed, and high-calorie foods. The idea of cost, we tend to buy things that are less expensive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a bargain, that a meal at a fast food restaurant looks cheap, but if you buy the ingredients and make that meal at home, you may end up spending more up front, but that will be because you tend to buy more stuff, because you're not just buying like one ketchup packet. You might be buying more of the different condiments, and you probably would be buying more than one hamburger worth of meat. So the cost may be more on the surface, but there have been some people who have done calculations, and you can look some of these up online, that show that making food at home is actually generally less expensive than eating out. But then there's a question of availability. Can you even get food? And I'm sure you've all heard Michelle Obama talking about food deserts, where people live places where they just can't access healthy food. That if you can't get it, obviously you can't eat it. And if all that's available to you is processed junk foods, then that's probably what you're going to tend to eat because that's what's available. So it may take a little bit more work or maybe even too much work between convenience and availability to eat the foods that are probably the best for you. But it's going to be a trade-off that you consider in the long run and with careful thought before you just cave into what looks convenient and what's easy to get. What your family and friends eat and how your family and friends look makes a difference. People with obese friends tend to be more likely to be obese themselves, same with families. Outside of the genetic influence, there's the sort of environment about how people eat and what people eat. There's the neighborhood that you live in. There's the culture that you come from about sort of what's acceptable to eat that's going to influence your choices as well. There's also food engineering and food marketing, which I wanted to talk a little bit about. Food, the processed foods are actually engineered. They are created in a way to maximize the tendency of most people to crave those particular foods. So the food industry, and if you're really interested in the food industry, the book by Michael Moss, or you can find an article online, or you can find all sorts of videos of Michael Moss, and there the links are in your reference list, who talks about the degree of effort the food companies put into making food that you're going to crave. I think it's important to consider, and it makes it very difficult to resist. And then there are the marketing factors. So I wanted to, where people are constantly in your face about you should eat this, you should eat that, TV ads and billboards and signs and so on. I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the subtleties of how the environment influences you. And I'll just give you one funny example. This was on a podcast, a Freakonomics podcast, and they interviewed Brian Wansink several times on Freakonomics, which is how I got clued into his work. So Freakonomics did this experiment where they served, totally unscientific, but they served people, they said 2 types of peanut butter sandwiches. One type, they wanted to find out if people preferred one peanut butter sandwich to another. And so they had some peanut butter sandwiches on plain plates and some peanut butter sandwiches on red plates. Now, they actually were the same sandwich, made out of the same bread and the same peanut butter. But many of the people who tested them said that the ones on the red plate were much, much better. So without recognizing it, you are going to be influenced by some of these sort of subtleties. And if you want to learn more about how the environment influences people, Brian Wansink is definitely your guy. So that's the sort of where you eat. I wanted to talk a little bit about why you eat. These are some factors that affect why you eat, and because they affect why you eat, they're going to affect some of the choices that you make about what to eat as well. So the first one I want to talk about for a minute was fuel. And one of the things about controlling eating that is different from controlling some other habits or behaviors that you have in your life is that you actually do have to eat. You have to have food for fuel in order to manage. And there's a nice quote by Brian Wansink on the first page of the handout that says, We have millions of years of evolution telling us to eat as often as we can and as much as we can. Our bodies fight against deprivation. So your body is going to tell you that you need to eat on a regular basis, and your body becomes accustomed to eating certain things at certain times of day. And so some of the messages that your body is telling you are related to your need for fuel, and some of the messages your body is telling you is related to your body's habit to get food at a particular time of day. So there are certain food instincts as well. One of the most interesting ones is the attachment that people have to sugar. Particularly infants are very drawn to sweet foods. There's a certain attraction, physical attraction also to salty foods, and there's a very strong physical attraction to fat foods. And when you put sugar, salt, and fat together in combination, it really hits all those food instincts that originally come from this need for fuel, but it also makes you want them in a way where you crave them or you prefer them over time, which sort of confounds your ability to tell whether you need to eat this particular thing because you're hungry. The whole business of preferences is very interesting. So there are these natural preferences that people have, which are things like sugar, fat, and salt. And then there are acquired preferences, like, for example, the amount of salt, how salty your food is both an instinctual preference and an acquired preference. So there have been some studies looking at how long it takes people to get over the taste of a high-salt diet, and I think it's something like 120 days that people it takes people to sort of retrain their palate for salt. And I was reading today's newspaper, coincidentally, here in New Hampshire, or central New Hampshire, was an article about changing cafeteria foods at schools. And they did a study where they had chefs come in to the schools and change what people were offered and how they were offered to see if it would change the choices that the children made. And after 3 months, an increased availability of vegetables and fruit did not change behavior at all, but by 7 months it did. So that was interesting to me to think of the timeline in terms of how long it might take somebody to begin to make some choices naturally, even with the environment sort of nudging them in that direction. So I mentioned already about food engineering that relates directly to the idea of craving. There's this engineering, I guess they're an engineering firm in, I think it's New York, and they've been hired frequently by food companies to identify things that they call the bliss point for certain levels of ingredients. So the bliss point is how much of this can we put in before it starts to taste like too much. So, for example, they've identified in many products the bliss point of sugar, like how much sugar can you put in where people want more, they want more, they want more, but then you get to a point where more than that is too much. And so it's sort of over the top of this curve. They interestingly have said that there seems to be almost no bliss point for fat, which in my own personal taste buds is not entirely true, but it's an interesting point. So craving, craving is, when I think of craving, I think it as physical, like the need for fuel, that you have this extremely intense desire for something that drives you to all sorts of lengths to get that particular thing. And so that raises the question, which I also tried to find out about, which people ask me from time to time, whether there is such a thing as food addiction. And apparently Many people say no, although some people say that sugar is addictive. It is interesting to note that there is something called a food addiction scale developed by some people at Yale, which you can find online if you're interested, the Yale Food Addiction Scale. I found this after I had already prepared my handout. But this includes things like I find that when I start eating certain foods, I end up eating much more than planned. I eat to the point where I feel physically ill. I find myself constantly eating certain foods throughout the day, and so on. So this scale is looking at sort of the degree to which people eat more than they intend, the degree to which they eat in spite of it having negative effects, which are some characteristics that apply to the notion of addiction or substance dependence. I'm not sure that those other basic criteria of tolerance and withdrawal apply to eating. Like, is there a certain amount of sugar that if you eat a certain amount of sugar, then you have to have more and more to get the same effect? I'm not sure that that's correct. And also withdrawal, if you stop having it, do you have physiological a reaction where you have signs and symptoms that directly react, and I'm not so sure about that either. So I'd say the food addiction under the category of craving, the food addiction question is sort of unanswered at this point. Emotions certainly do play a part. I was talking to a friend of mine about this. Actually, I've been talking to everybody about this because I find it so interesting. But I was talking about this, and this friend is somebody who has been in a 12-step program, and she says that the idea of the acronym HALT, which is related to the things that make you vulnerable to drinking rather than staying sober, include hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And I certainly think that these 4 things apply to people's tendency to overeat. Obviously, if you're hungry, you're going to eat, and you may end up overeating if you're too hungry, which is one of the theories behind having snacks instead of just 3 meals. And then there are lots of people who eat when they're angry and lonely, or they have other complicated emotions. And if you're interested in learning more about emotional eating, the reference on that is Janine Roth. She's listed in your references too. And then the tired piece. So I talked about hungry, angry, lonely. The tired piece, I think, has to do with partly the fuel issue, that your body may be looking for more fuel. It also has to do with limited willpower as a limited resource, that when you're too tired, it's physiologically you don't have the fuel in your energy in your body that you need to be able to resist temptation. So emotional eating makes a difference. Habit and cues have to do with what habits you have, what cues you have. Brian Wansink also did a study where he put a candy dish near a person, and then he put the candy dish 6 feet away, and having the candy dish even that near 6 feet, but still that far, it dramatically reduced the amount of candy that people ate because they would have to get up and actually go over to the candy. So the degree to which you can hide the food, keep it out of sight, keep it at a distance, don't have it where you walk by it constantly, don't drive home by the places that are too tempting to you. All these sorts of things are going to make a difference if you think about why you eat. I wanted to talk next about your thoughts about food. Certainly, it's well recognized that thought affects behavior. And so these are just some examples of thoughts that I think contribute to people's decisions and actions that they make without deciding about what they eat. So first of all, what do you know about what you should eat and what's healthy and what's not healthy? And how much do you hold that knowledge in your own head? The second question is, what do you believe about food and about eating? So We had a family dinner last weekend. It was pizza. We were eating pizza, and we had, this is the extended family, and we had reheated some of the pizzas in the oven, and one of the pizzas had got a little bit burned on one side. And so one of the people in the family was eating a piece of burned pizza, and another person in the family was saying, you know, there's more pizza left, you don't have to eat the burned piece. And he said, well, I was raised to believe that you eat what you get and that you empty your plate. So there are things like that, and this was so strongly ingrained in him in the way he was raised, that he was persisted in eating the burned pizza right down to the nubbin instead of replacing it with the piece of pizza that would have been better. So what do you believe about food? What do you believe about eating? Those things are going to affect your choices. What does your family and community believe? What are the norms in your particular neighborhood? What are the things that in your culture about what you should eat, when you should eat certain things, how much you should eat, whether you should empty your plate or not empty your plate? All those sorts of things are going to make a difference. How skeptical are you? Do you believe everything you read, or do you doubt everything that you read? Obviously, if you believe everything that you read, you're going to be sort of vulnerable in terms of the information that's available, much of which is promulgated by people who have an investment in you buying or eating their particular product. So skepticism, I think, makes a difference. How open are you to change? When I do wellness coaching and training, and I have somebody, a trainee in the group, says, well, I don't eat vegetables. And I say, well, you mean maybe you don't eat a lot of vegetables? And he says, no, I mean, I do not eat any vegetables. And he makes it very clear that he does not eat vegetables. He has never eaten vegetables. He never will eat vegetables. And the fact that he's not even open to considering the possibility of making changes in what he eats is going to make a difference, too, in whether he's going to be able to eat a healthy diet or not. He's certainly not going to be eating kale in the near future. There is your sort of the actual facts of your willpower, but there's also the way you think about yourself as somebody with or without willpower. I hear people describe themselves as lazy, weak-willed, some sorts of negative terms. It sounds like the idea is that they don't believe in their own capacity to make change. So there's a researcher named Carol Dweck, and I think you can find her online. She is not, she is on the reference list. She has this concept called mindset. And her idea is that people have ways they think of themselves and ways they explain their behaviors or their accomplishments or the lack of accomplishments. And some of those ways are related to people saying, well, I didn't try hard enough, or I didn't study enough, or I shouldn't have looked at the dessert menu, or whatever the thing is, where they look at their actions. And then there are people who describe themselves in terms of these broad and permanent characteristics. I'm not smart, I'm weak-willed, I'm lazy. And the more you define yourself in those sort of permanent characteristic terms, the less likely you are going to be somebody who's going to engage in efforts to change. So these are not magical questions. These are not the only questions. This is just a list of questions that happened to pop into my mind when I was thinking about how thought might influence somebody's relationship to food and to eating. So the interesting question is then, of course, what do you do about it? So I want to talk a little bit about changing your thoughts. And this is something that I've been doing based on what I've been reading, and my husband's been doing based on my rants about what I'm reading. So I wanted to suggest a couple of things. The first one is to reframe the claim. Is just because somebody says a certain food is a certain type of food, particularly processed food labels, you have to be suspicious about that. So one of the things you might not realize is that low-fat foods are often low-fat because they're high in added sugar. You also might not know, I certainly didn't know this until my recent reading, Jay, that low salt doesn't mean that the salt is gone. It means often that the salt is replaced by potassium. Now, for some people, potassium may be easier to tolerate on their bodies than sodium, but low salt doesn't necessarily mean that the salty flavor is gone. It's just replacing one thing with another. So reframing the claims, be suspicious about what do people really mean when they say something is healthy or natural or organic. It's important to understand that. Compost is organic, but it's not necessarily something I'm going to feed my grandson for lunch. So you don't necessarily want to eat something just because it's organic or just because it's so-called natural. So you have to reframe the claims in your own mind. Really think about what you read and what people say with a healthy dose of suspicion. The notion of how you respond to temptation, this idea about willpower and how you manage to deal with things that you want that you don't want. This idea of cool versus hot thoughts comes from a guy named Walter Mischel, who's a psychologist who's very well known for a lot of things in the field, and most particularly well known for what people are inclined to call the marshmallow test. And this test was something that he did many decades ago. I remember hearing about it when I was early in my academic career, and he just recently, just within the last year, published a book about it, which is quite easy to read. But you can also find all sorts of videos if you just Google the marshmallow test or go to YouTube and look for the marshmallow test. So let me tell you what the marshmallow test was. The marshmallow test was where you put children in a room with a marshmallow. And there are many varieties in this, but the simple version is you say, if you can sit here for 15 minutes and not eat the marshmallow, then when I come back, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. So the question was, which kids could resist the marshmallow and which kids could not resist the marshmallow? The second question was, how did they, the ones who were able to resist it, how did they resist it? And then could you transfer those techniques to other people? And then the third question is, what happened to those kids in the long run? So yes, there was a definite difference between people who did and didn't. And one of the things was what Mischel called cool versus hot thought. So one of the examples of cool thought, the sort of cooling down the temptation, was one of the kids said, well, I just pretended that it was a picture of a marshmallow and not really a marshmallow, and you can't eat a picture. So he was able to look at it in a way that cooled down his desire, as opposed to hot thoughts where you sit there and you think about, oh, marshmallow, delicious, squishy, sweet, it's got that little powdery stuff on the outside, how can I resist it? Oh, I can smell it from here. Those sort of hot thoughts that prompt you to want more and make it more difficult to resist. So Mischel talked about learning to create this strategy of cool versus hot thought. And then the other sort of sidebar question, what happened to these kids? He actually did follow them into adulthood. And the kids who were able to resist the marshmallow did better in school. They were more likely to go to college, and they ended up having higher income. So it's a trait or a skill that makes a huge difference in a person's life. And when you think about your own ability to resist temptation, the ability of the folks you provide services to resist temptation, it will put you in mind of the idea that perhaps developing some self-regulatory skills, some ability to resist temptation might be a good direction to go in. So one idea related to this reframing the claims, repicturing, changing your thoughts, repicturing something like sugar to make it a cool versus a hot thought is to think about something being nurturing or delicious on the one hand or poisonous on the other. And I had this happen when I became allergic to chocolate. I was a serious chocoholic. I could not resist any chocolate anywhere. If someone put any chocolate nearby me, all I could think about was the chocolate. I didn't hear what they said. It was really serious. Once I became allergic to chocolate, I have not the least bit interest in chocolate anymore. It doesn't smell delicious to me. I'm just not interested. And one of the things that I found reading all these books about how terrible sugar is for you is that I have reframed the idea of sugar as poison in my mind, and my husband has been contaminated by the same perspective now. So it's completely and radically changed his grocery shopping behaviors over the last 6 months or so. I did want to just take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about sugar because I think it's really relevant. I know this is in the category of it's what you eat, but I wanted to revisit this and point out that the average sugar consumption for adults is 22 spoonfuls a day in the United States. The average sugar consumption for children is 32 teaspoons a day. Relatively a recent guide from the World Health Organization limit free sugar being added sugar, because there are, of course, natural sugars in fruits and milk and stuff like that. But they recommend limiting free sugar to, based on my calculations, 8 to 9 teaspoons a day for adults. And adults are currently eating around 22 spoonfuls a day. So let's just take a couple seconds and talk about that in context. So here's a great graphic. You can find lots of these on sugarstacks.com that shows you the number of teaspoons in a can of soda, which is you count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So one soda and you're already over the World Health Organization guidelines for adding sugar to your daily diet. I also wanted to mention, and this is on the handout with the associated references, diet soda is maybe not necessarily the savior for avoiding sugar. A couple of things I wanted to say. Diet drinks definitely do cut calories, and they certainly can make a difference in terms of weight loss. However, in one study, people who were healthiest tended to be those who ate a prudent diet and did not consume diet beverages. And there's another study that shows that drinking even 1 can of soda a day, whether it's regular or diet, can increase your risk factor for heart disease. So diet soda is not necessarily the solution. It may be because people who drink diet soda develop a taste for sweeter foods. It may be because they compensate for the calorie savings by eating more. I'm not sure. And you certainly are going to need to draw your own conclusions about that. I also want to take a minute to talk about misleading food messages. So when you look at this, I did this next series of slides I did at a related workshop last week. And when I show these 2 slides, which is better, as you might guess, people pick the yogurt. And I wanted to point out that there is a difference in composition here. The Fruit Loops actually have about a cup of Fruit Loops has about half as much sugar as one of these sort of tiny things of Yoplait, and has more fiber and has less fat. Not that I am recommending that you eat Fruit Loops, but I want to point out that 2 cups of Fruit Loops is still less sugar than 1 little tiny thing of Yoplait. Of course, it's also less protein. So somebody might wonder, well, what about options? And I wanted to just say that here's another option. Now you have much less sugar, and I'm not necessarily recommending this cereal, but I just want to point out the Fruit Loops numbers are based on a cup. The Heritage Flakes numbers are based on 3/4 of a cup, so they don't exactly apply. So it's more calories, it's way less sugar, it's more fiber, and it's about the same amount of fat. It's also much more protein. There's 1 gram of protein in a cup of Fruit Loops, and in a whole cup of the Heritage Flakes, there's 5 grams of protein. So a little bit of comparison. is important when you're making considerations about what you're going to eat, what you're going to choose. And don't assume that, for example, yogurt is better for you than cereal. I wanted to mention a little bit the business of food. This goes back to the idea of changing your framework. This comes partly from the Michael Moss book. I wanted to point out that Nabisco is owned by R.J. Reynolds, the people who brought you Joe Camel. Doritos is owned by Pepsi, the Pepsi company, who also owns Frito-Lay's. Stacy Pita Chips, which my husband was buying because he thought there was an independent company. And Pepsi also owns Aquafina water, which is filtered town water and not spring water. Annie's, which I always thought was, I always thought it was really a much better choice, and it probably is in terms of what you eat, but it's owned by General Mills, who also own Betty Crocker, Pillsbury, and Yoplait. And Coca-Cola owns Dasani water, Evian water, Honest Tea, and Minute Maid juices. So some of what you see out there is these companies trying to diversify in the event that the message of eating less sugar and particularly drinking more soda really takes hold. And it's also partly interesting that you've got people who are very experienced in the business of addiction and marketing around tobacco who are now using some of those same knowledge and skills to apply to food. So somebody asked, what about Oikos Greek yogurt? If you get plain yogurt, there's no added sugar in it at all. If you get the flavored yogurt, I think the last time I checked a container of Oikos Greek yogurt that had the fruit on the bottom, I think it was 21 grams of sugar. And I think somewhere around 6, if you take the plain yogurt jar container and you compare it to the fruit yogurt jar, the plain yogurt will tell you how much natural sugar is in there, and the fruit yogurt jar will tell you how much added sugar there is. And I think the last time I checked, you have to double check me next time you're at the supermarket, I think the plain yogurt has about 6 grams of natural sugar, and the fruit yogurt has about 21 grams of natural sugar. So that's about 15 grams of added sugar, which is also puts you over the guidelines for the World Health Organization. Thank you for the question. I should add that to list the next time. Next time I present it. So the moral of the story, so these are my 3 messages, and then we have time for questions, and I do hope you have questions. I may or may not have the answers, but I certainly will entertain your questions, answer what I can, and what I can't answer, I will find out for you if I can find the answer. So the moral of the story is learn everything you can. For those of you who have taken wellness coaching, you know about health literacy, and you can use your health literacy skills to evaluate health claims, to evaluate the messages that people give you about food. So learning also involves being skeptical, not being gullible, and being very, very curious about learning as much as you can. The second one is listen, and this is really listen to your body and listen to your own thoughts. Everybody's body is going to be slightly different, and even though in this A to Z study, the Atkins diet came out best for the whole group, there were people who did very well on each of the other diets. So to some extent, what diet works for you is going to not necessarily be what diet works best for the average person. So you need to listen, you need to sort of track, you need to use a little bit of scientific mindedness to get a sense of what's really the best possible diet, eating pattern, time of day, formula of putting all these things together that's going to work for you. And then the last one is take charge of your diet, and taking charge not only of what you eat, but also when you eat, how you eat, where you eat, and why you eat. And that's basically what I wanted to say, so I'm open to questions now. So I guess, Katie, you want people to type them in?
Yeah, they can either type them in or raise their hand, and I'll unmute their line if they have their audio PIN number entered. I know that Lisa had a question, and I have her line unmuted if you'd like to ask your question, Lisa.
Sure.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I was really interested in the Yale food addiction scale you mentioned, and I was thinking about, we tell people change behavior. You can't, stop a behavior without replacing a behavior. That's really tough with food when people don't have the funding either, or the food pantry resources don't provide the healthiest. So are there any treatments or studies, and if so, can you describe them, that you know of, Pat, that talk about treatments of food-related behavior change if related to the Yale's notion that possibly there is food addiction or not? I was kind of thinking of DBT, breaking the behavior chain and kind of looking at how to break it, how to change the behavior, but I haven't really heard of any studies that have addressed it. If food addiction theory is such, which you kind of indicated, that Yale had done at scale, but.
Yes, and as near as I can tell, and I must say that, I probably could spend several more days on this if I were going to really do a thorough hunt for this, but as near as I can tell from my cursory review, the Yale Food Addiction Scale is really trying to answer the question, is there food addiction? Not necessarily what you would do about it. However, I will point out that there has been Overeaters Anonymous for years, and they take a very strong stance that there is food addiction, and the way to deal with it is the 12-step program. I think the challenge is with food, you can't just say no. You can't abstain from food. You will not be able to survive. But in OA, and I have not been to OA myself, but I do have a friend who goes to OA, they take a very strong stance that sugar and white flour are addictive substances. And so that's sort of the framework. There may be other things in there too, but I know for my friend, that's the framework for her around her eating, is that she's really very clear about that. The same things, I think, would apply to dealing with other addictions. You want to avoid the places where you're going to be out of control. You want to keep the stuff you shouldn't be having outside of the house, and so on and so forth. I will also add that there are complicating factors, that people who have one addiction may have another addiction. There is some people suggest that people who get off alcohol tend to eat a higher sugar diet because their bodies are accustomed to the carbohydrates in the alcohol, and that it takes a while to make that shift, if it's at all possible. And I think there are also complicating factors such as history of trauma and what food does for people in terms of managing their emotions and activating their reward centers. There's a whole lot of the work on emotional eating that Janine Roth has done doesn't really address the question of addiction so much, but really gets at some of the complicated things about body image and self-esteem and the messages of food for a particular individual. So it's not a terribly satisfactory answer to your question. I think this is one of those where you're going to have to stay tuned for it. I think it's a reasonable consideration, though, in a community that knows as much about addictions as the mental health, the behavioral health systems do. I think it's a reasonable way to proceed, which is to consider the possibility of food addiction, and that cravings for many people have some sort of foundation in addiction that may need to be addressed.
Thanks so much. Seems like
Sure.
It's a whole area of study, really. Address treatments that would be helpful for dealing with addiction-related food because, as you said, it is a necessity. So I guess it's about making better choices, replacing less healthy foods for more healthy foods, and, you know, it's interesting topic. Thank you so much.
And for some people, like the difference between a social drinker, you know, is it ever possible for somebody who was an alcoholic to become a social drinker? That question, you know, is it ever possible for somebody who's sort of a sugar addict? Is it possible for that person to, you know, eat anything that contains sugar? I mean, I don't really have those questions. But it may be that for some people who see their food issues as being addictive, there may be some things that they just have to make a food rule for themselves. I will never eat X. Okay, we have another question. Any specific suggestions to provide to people that eat ramen noodles due to cost and ease of preparation? Find a lot of people with limited resources and food prep skills complain about cost and difficulty of preparation. Yeah, and when I didn't have money and still for convenience, I eat a lot of ramen noodles too, and I think there are a couple of sort of food tips that you think about. First of all, the ramen noodles by themselves aren't going to have much in the way of fiber, and they have those little horrible salty chemical packets that go in with them. If people skip the packet or just put in a tiny bit of the packet, it will probably reduce some of the problems. And there are things that you can make with ramen noodles. One of my absolute favorite meals, and I know this is not a workshop on bargain recipes, but one of my favorite and most delicious ramen noodle meals is you put in a little chicken or a little tofu or whatever sort of protein you have on hand. You put in frozen broccoli, and you also add a teaspoon or a tablespoon, up to a tablespoon of peanut butter, and then you add a little bit of chili powder, and it ends up tasting like Thai peanut noodles, and it's absolutely fantastically delicious. And by adding the peanut butter and the broccoli, you're actually getting something good into them. Okay, another question. One of the misleading messages is that food label lists unrealistic serving sizes. Oh, that's terrible. Does that mean the serving sizes on the labels are much less than what people really eat? Yes, absolutely. So, for example, a serving size of Chips Ahoy cookies, I think, is a cookie and a half. I've never heard of anybody who has 1.5 cookies. You know, people eat at least 2 or 3 or 4 cookies when they eat cookies. Not that they necessarily should be eating cookies anyways. But if you start looking at the serving sizes on the labels, just as a way of educating yourself, it's quite shocking. And there are some advocates who are talking about revising the food labels, and the revisions to the food labels would be to adjust to standard serving sizes. So like the cereal example, you know, maybe standard serving size for all cereals should be 1 cup, something like that. And then one of the other changes that's recommended is to begin to distinguish natural sugars in the food from added sugars. And that certainly would make it a lot easier to determine how to compare one food to another. So I hope that answers that question. What do you do when you're trying to teach families how to eat healthy but continue to not attempt to eat healthy, mean not eating healthy yourself? Do you continue to try to promote healthy living even though they are constantly gaining weight? Oh, I see. How do you teach them when they're not doing it? Well, this gets into the motivational questions that we address in wellness coaching. You can't make people do what they don't want to do. So you can begin to affect what people want to do by sharing messages with them in a way that's not nagging and not brutalizing them by beating them over the head with it, not shaming them. And then if there's any sign or interest in people making change, then you begin to make an effort to make things, help them make things different. Certainly the motivational interviewing material will really help you think a lot about how do you begin to convince or persuade people. If you don't offer things in your own programs, if you limit the kinds of things that are available in your agency's vending machines, if you have literature available and signs that promote other ways of eating, I think, these things are going to, in the long run, make a difference. If you think about the decrease in smoking in the general public, a lot of that had to do with the Surgeon General warning and the strong messages that came out. But it's taken a long time, and that message has not really changed smoking behavior that much in people with serious psychiatric disorders. So I'm not sure of the answer. I think the answer to how do you make somebody change what they eat, you can't. That's the answer. Is they have to recognize it's something they want to do. Here's somebody sharing, I lost over 100 pounds over a 1-year period. Congratulations from that. Mindful daily walking, eating more than I had eaten previously, but healthier options, which I think is often the case. You can eat a heck of a lot more salad than cookies and have it really count as fewer calories. I started eating breakfast, increased my sleep from 4.5 hours to 7 to 8. There's a pretty strong connection between number of hours of sleep per night and BMI. Fewer hours of sleep increases the likelihood that people will be obese. So, Christy, congratulations on that. That's absolutely fantastic. And you're doing a lot of the things that people recommend that folks do to lose weight. So it's certainly not easy, but it is possible. It's certainly not easy for people who are poor, who have trauma histories, who have mental health conditions, but it is possible. And the issues have to do with helping people learn what it takes to eat well and how eating well can affect their general wellness. It has to do with teaching them to listen to their own bodies and consider their options. And it has to do with encouraging them to take charge of their own lives. So we have one more question, and this is the last one. How would you have dealt with the conversation when the person says they will just take diet pills off the counter at the store and eat what they want? They often don't care if the pills are unhealthy or don't work. Well, I would reinforce the idea that the pills are unhealthy and don't work. I would encourage people to talk to their doctors and to meet with a nutritionist. But that's an example probably of somebody who still has some sort of magical thinking, like the idea that if you read about a diet, you'll lose weight, the idea that there's a magical pill. I mean, there is absolutely no magical pill out there. The only medication that has been found to be effective for weight loss has serious and significant side effects that are often potentially fatal. So it's just a matter of continuing to educate people and to be sure that you don't shame them, that you help them explore what they want, and you help them recognize that it's all small steps, small changes add up to a big difference. And I think we're at the end. Thanks to all of you for coming. I could talk about this all day, so it was very nice to have you be interested, and it's great to have the questions. You can certainly contact me with other questions through my website, patnemec.com. There's a link there for email, or you can see my email down at the bottom, patnemec@patnemec.com. The website's also on the handout. And that's it. Katie, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, thank you everybody for attending. I will be sending a follow-up email again with the documents that were presented in the handout. I did send them previously, but I may have missed a couple people that signed in late, so I will be sending those as a follow-up. And we thank you and hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.